Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. So today, the guest, of course, is me, Scott Greer. I had one of my fans on Twitter who mocked the idea of me being the guest. There was this user called Sims Enjoyer who, they mocked me saying, like, welcome back to Highly Respected. Your guest today is Scott Greer, and it had a saw going after a phone. So I know that Sims Enjoyer is listening, and I have not forgotten you. And, when you least expect it, I'm going to get you back. So if you ever dare criticize the solo episodes, you're going on my list. So that goes out for all the fans out there. Just a note, I have to do this. This is necessary. But anyway, going on to the topics. There are a ton of news going on, as it is every week. I mean, Biden has not returned us to normality at all. The first thing to up is we're having riots again, even though Derek Chauvin has not been exonerated. There has not been a conclusion to the George Floyd trial. We're seeing riots in the Minneapolis area. Last night in a Minneapolis suburb, Brooklyn Center. I don't know why they call it Brooklyn Center. There's like Brooklyns all over the place. But there was a black man who was on warrant. There are reports he may have been armed. He fled from police when they stopped him to serve a warrant. And in the ensuing scuffle, he was shot dead. Of course, I'm sure he was on his way to cure cancer or work at NASA or some other highly prestigious service job before he was shot by police. And the whole community came together, and his family, they showed, because he's mixed race, and he's got a white mom, and his siblings are run the gamut of every color and race. It's like the model family in Babylon. Anyway, they're showing they're showing the family there, get the community riled up, and the community began fighting with police, jumping on cop cars, and this escalated to looting. They looted everything: Foot Locker, Little Caesars for some reason. It reminded me of the fall of Rome, or the sack of Rome in 410, when the Visigoths tore through Rome. I guess the new residents of this Minneapolis suburb are the Visigoths. And Little Caesars, of course, is Rome. Little Caesars has fallen. And they went through that. They also started damaging the police station, et cetera, et cetera. So we're seeing this anytime that a black person is shot by police, they will riot, and we're going to see more of this as it gets to warm up. I mean, we're springtime now, not yet white boy summer, but we can only imagine the level of violence that will happen if a verdict is returned that is less than murder for Derek Chauvin, because Derek Chauvin is likely going to go to jail, but for tax evasion and those charges, corruption. What happens with the murder trial? We'll have to see. I mean, if you've been paying attention to the prosecution lately, it's not going so well. They keep having the experts who come up who immediately say, "Oh, I think it was the windpipe," and then the defense attorney is like, well, excusing all these circumstances of police, what would you rule as the cause of death for George Floyd? And they would say, oh, it's heart disease, obviously. And it's clear evidence that he swallowed a bunch of drugs before he was arrested. He had done this the previous year and had nearly had a stroke. Looks like the same thing happened in this case. They may get some some type of misconduct against Derek Chauvin, maybe a manslaughter charge. I think, in a serious justice system, he would not be getting murder charges. He probably wouldn't even be getting manslaughter charges. But of course, we don't live in a serious, objective, impartial justice system anymore. We can only imagine that the jurors, especially the black ones, have already made up their minds. And it doesn't matter what evidence they're seeing, they're going to try for a guilty verdict. I think most likely case is a mistrial over the murder charges, and that will set off another bout of rioting all over the nation, not just in Minneapolis area. So that is something to keep an eye on. Of course, Highly Respected will keep an eye on this as we move forward. But going to move on to other topics, namely Tucker Carlson. Sure enough, Tucker is in trouble again, like always. But this time, He's got the Anti-Defamation League calling for his firing. Last week in an interview with Mark Stein, he brought up the Great Replacement, which you're not supposed to bring up. You cannot mention how our leaders are demographically replacing the native population here in America and in Europe. Cannot bring that up. Anyway, Tucker made a very poignant discussion talking about how the Democrats are bringing over voters from the third world to replace the electorate here, and it's undermining the native population's voting rights. He made sure to say, like, oh, this isn't about race or white replacement theory, but I mean, like, clearly it was about the Great Replacement and demographic replacement, but couched in terms that would have been appropriate for Fox News. And it's like largely true. I've always made this point that if you say, like, talk about the Great Replacement as good, you're a well-respected analyst on CNN or New York Times or Washington Post. But if you say the exact same facts, saying that, like, there's demographic replacement going on of the white population, we're not going to see a white majority in America anymore, and that's a bad thing, then you're a conspiracy theorist and you have to be yanked off the air. And that's what happened with Tucker's situation. There was a funny example of this, is that I actually was able to prove this, is I quote tweeted a CNN analyst, Juliet Kayyem. I guess that's how you pronounce it. She's a former Obama administration official, all around terrible person who just gives away everything that they, supports every terrible idea. She wrote this on Twitter. She said, Tucker is coy because he is also correct in one sense. Replacement is occurring. Young white men today are the last generation of Americans born when Caucasian births outnumber those of non-whites. This trend will continue, and it animates the racist violence. I tweeted out, my thing is, like, if you say this is bad, you're a conspiracy theorist. If you say this is, bad. If you say this is good, you're a well-respected CNN analyst. And sure enough, she liked the tweet. So agreeing with me, I guess she had no idea who I was. But it does go to show that they are outright in this. It's like, it depends on the factors you're saying this. But in the ADL's case, they're saying that, like, oh, this is spurring white supremacist violence. The El Paso shooter was justified this. The Christchurch shooter said the same thing. The Daily Show had a really unfunny parody video saying that Tucker plagiarized his ideas from those two shooters' manifestos. And this is how they always say it. It's like, even daring to mention an obvious fact that every single mainstream outlet reports on and celebrates. But if you take a different perspective and say it's bad, because, I mean, we rarely had a situation where, good things happen from one population gets replaced by another. We brought up one Roman Empire, Rome previously, there's definitely big changes going on. And Tucker always makes this point, and I think his, point that he made in his rant to Mark Stein was on the mark. It's like saying that, like, you lose your right to vote if it's undermined by somebody who just came here 5 years ago, and they're clearly going to vote for things that you fundamentally disagree with. I mean, if you look at all the polling, is like saying that, like, Hispanic immigrants and Asian immigrants both overwhelmingly favor big government, gun control, affirmative action. Yeah, even though affirmative action hurts Asians, the younger generation overwhelmingly still supports it. Gun rights, as I mentioned previously, gun rights, religious freedom, of course, immigration, and all these factors that you fundamentally change your country. And this is something that, you can only discuss in the context of celebrating it. You cannot condemn it. Now, conservatives are comfortable with talking about demographic replacement, just not in America. They love to talk about it in China. So if Tucker had said, to replace Americans with Uyghurs and third world voters with Han, and he'd been talking about Xinjiang, there would have been, oh, this is so powerful. This is so true that the Han are demographically replacing the poor little Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And we have to stop this. And they do the same with Hong Kong, with Tibet. That is okay to talk about demographic replacement. And it's very funny whenever these major outlets talk about China, they will often say things that are happening here in the West, and not just in America, but in Europe as well, with both censorship and the demographic replacement, etc. And then they will say, oh, this is so awful that that the Chinese are importing mainlanders to Hong Kong. It's like, what do you think our elites are doing here in America? Or like the funniest ever is like, this is horrible. There was like some, I think it was an NPR reporter who was like talking about how horrible it was that the Chinese were debanking Hong Kong activists. And I'm, over here, they're already debanking people. I mean, Gav has had like gone through multiple banks who have rejected them. I know several people have been rejected by payment processors, have been kicked out from nearly every payment processor. And this is due to their dissident politics. They even do that with Telegram. One of the funniest things about Telegram is there was like news reports about Telegram saying like a thing used by political dissidents is being used by far right extremists. It's like, well, what do you think those are in the West? So there's this kind of sense that people there's a lack of self awareness in talking about this issue from the mainstream side of that. They set the perimeters, and Tucker went outside the perimeters, and the ADL, which is like an escalation. I mean, I think people take the ADL far more seriously than they do the SPLC. If the SPLC called for Tucker's firing, nobody would pay attention to it because people now imagine the SPLC as a far left institution. ADL is much more serious. Unfortunately, Republicans still give them credence in a way that they would never give that same credibility to the SPLC. But so far, Fox seems to be ignoring it. They seem to be shrugging it, which I think is a very important step, is that we, the right no longer kowtows to the ADL. It ignores them. It's like, you're just a far left institution. We're going to shun what you have to say. We're going to keep doing what we want to do. And what Tucker said was fine. Even though in their defense of Tucker, they made a funny. I saw a Fox spokesman who's like, "Oh, he was not talking about white replacement theory. He was talking about voting rights, and that means that it's not great replacement." Which, whatever helps keep Tucker on the air, I guess. But it is a funny distinction that doesn't really matter. I mean, they're taking the voting rights away because of replacement. But even though Tucker is going in places that we couldn't have imagined Fox News hosts daring to venture into 5 years ago, a lot of people on the right, the right-wing Twitter, are getting a little bit harsher on Tucker. At least the big figures are. I was seeing comments, certain people who are friends of the show, so not really attacking them or anything, but they were complaining that Tucker didn't mention white people and he didn't make it a race thing, and that this undermined the whole point of his rant, and it made it cucked. There was other people who are definitely not friends of the show, who are wash-ups from the alt-right of 2016 and 2017, who are complaining that Tucker just doesn't get it. The demographic replacement isn't the threat. It's white. It's suburban whites. And even when they were complaining about Tucker, they were talking about how the elite is getting replaced itself by non-whites. And they were citing the recent Princeton incoming class of 2025, where 68% of the class defines itself as non-white, which, only less than a third of the class is white. And that likely includes, and that's also including many probably Jews who they themselves, a lot of them don't see themselves as white. So like probably white Gentile, it could be even lower than than 1/3, unless some of the Jews are calling themselves people of color now. We'll have to see. But like that is a part of demographic replacement as well, even though that's elite replacement, not necessarily the mass replacement we imagine from Hispanic and African and other types of immigration. That's still a part of the demographic replacement theory. So a lot of people are, getting upset with Tucker and, feuding with him. Some people have always hated Tucker because, they feel betrayed that he didn't have them on their show. Others feel that Tucker is now a competitor rather than, a bigger fish who will promote our ideas and potentially defend us. In subtle ways, such as what he did during the Groyper War. While not necessarily fully endorsing it, he kept attacking Charlie Kirk, and he would include Charlie Kirk sound bites that the Groyper War is going after, and then have a whole segment on it and why that's bad. So he was amplifying what the Groyper War was going after. And he does this in many cases. I mean, a lot of his people are seeing our stuff and are using that for inspiration from what I can tell. But people, just want to always attack, and I think it's a natural part of the of any political movement to have these feuds, and people feel like they're not getting their due, and to feel that some people aren't paying their proper gratitude towards others. I guess some people are always going to have this, but Tucker is ultimately on our side, and I don't think that there is anyone who's pushing our message further now than Tucker, especially with Trump is out of the Trump is largely out of the picture. I mean, he is not on Twitter every day. He is not the president of the United States. He is not driving the conversation anymore. Tucker, even though not necessarily to the same extent Trump was when he was in the White House, is now the person who's driving that conversation in our direction, who is pushing people in our general direction. I mean, if he can get millions and millions of boomers to nod along with talking points that would have only been seen on VDare or American Renaissance a few years ago, and now it's on the mainstream. Now it's like Fox News prime time, and there is an achievement in that. And I think a lot of people, yes, I mean, we don't have to necessarily think, oh my God, Tucker is saying this. It's like, we're going crazy anytime there's a Tucker segment, but I think we do acknowledge that Tucker is doing important work. He is advancing the cause, and he's waking up millions of people to our ideas. And and this is somebody saying this stuff in prime time. Fox News was unthinkable 5 or 6 years ago. I actually got in a discussion with somebody the other day, or, they were talking about, how people aren't going to know the truth about George Floyd, and whatever the case is, happens with that, they're not going to know the real side of it as they would have in, say, 2013 about George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, and then later on Michael Brown. That there were these due to the lack of tech censorship, that it was much easier to find this stuff on YouTube and Twitter and 4chan than it is today. And that there is a credibility. I understand that point is like tech censorship has had a very negative effect on our spheres and our ability to propagandize, for lack of a better term, in certain sectors. I mean, YouTube algorithms back in the day would lead you to some pretty radical videos. And Twitter, you could see all your friends going viral in 2015 and 2016. Now, it's not necessarily the case, even though, I still get some engagement, but I'm carrying the whole weight of right-wing Twitter on my back, and so do other people as well. And they were making other points saying that, like, well, liberal bloggers used to interact with Steve Saylor, and John Derbyshire used to have a, column on National Review. And yeah, I get those were nice things. I mean, those were showing that a certain elite commentariat were engaging with these ideas. But in the general mainstream, people are getting our ideas through Fox News, through talk radio, even through Twitter and social media. Even, yes, there is like more censorship. You are showing up in their timeline. Like somebody was saying, well, like Steve Saylor, liberal bloggers aren't interacting with him anymore. Well, he's now in the mentions and the replies of these liberal bloggers. And now, like, if there's a viral tweet, those thousands of people can now see Steve Saylor as one of the top responses. And there's several other examples. I think, yeah, there is like far more censorship. Like, we wouldn't have imagined that some ordinary boomer could be banned from Facebook for challenging the election results. This isn't even anybody normal, but there's like people this happens to. That was unthinkable 5 or 6 years ago. But at the same time, our ideas are far more prevalent in the general sphere, even though it is, if you're looking for stuff on YouTube and maybe Twitter and other places, yes, and Google search for certain, it is harder to find our stuff, but people are more aware of our ideas than at any time in recent American history. Even compared to the 60s and 50s, I think that more people are aware of our ideas than any time post World War II, in the United States at least. And that there is an achievement with that, and that is due to, in large part, due to Trump, and to secondary role is to Tucker. And, our ideas are now discussed all the time in New York Times, Washington Post, CNN. The current administration thinks our ideas are the most dangerous threat to the United States. and they feel that this is the underlying motivation of the Republican Party, even though it's really not. And there is an achievement in that. I think a lot of people, like, you know, they see their old world that the old political world that they grew up in, that they liked. I mean, there is a certain charm to the old days, to the way things were working in 2014 and 2015, where you didn't have to worry about getting kicked off Twitter or your blog deplatformed or debanked. There is like an appeal to that, but at the same time, the reasons why this is happening is because we're considered a greater threat, because they see our talking points repeated on Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham and on talk radio. And before Rush Limbaugh passed away, many of his ideas were sounding much more like VDARE than they would have classic conservatism. So this is, we are setting the paradigm now. We are a part of the mainstream discourse. We were not a part of the discourse 6 years ago. 5 years ago, yes. I mean, in 2016. But, pre-Trump, we were not a part of the discourse. No one was paying attention to our ideas. Yes, we weren't getting censored, but that's because we were considered irrelevant and not a threat. Nobody's talking about our ideas. New York Times and Washington Post were not devolving an article a day to talking about how awful we are for believing that, whites shouldn't be replaced, that whites aren't bad, or it's okay to be white. And now we see these ideas discussed all the time. And there is like a changes afoot going on within the right. So I think that, yeah, you can say like, well, they won't hear about the truth from, I guess, 4chan anymore, or algorithm, or a YouTube video that they discover in an algorithm. But there are other avenues for propaganda and for, idea discussion that are far bigger than those old platforms. And now they can find out about the truth on the George Floyd slaying from Fox News prime time. So I think, people shouldn't get too black-pilled about this, and know that we are advancing in a positive direction. And yes, we have far more challenges than we had before, but that's due to be expected, due to being an insurgent movement that challenges the prevailing order, and the prevailing order sees us as a threat. They're just not going to let us tweet in peace, so to speak. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing that we should appreciate Tucker on is his challenging of the January 6th narrative. I mean, and this January 6th narrative is integral to the tyrannical push that we're seeing from the Biden administration, from push for what are effectively hate speech laws, for more text censorship, for domestic terrorist legislation, for voting rights bill, for the supposed voting rights bill, even the opposition towards serious election reforms in Georgia. The even police reform, so-called police reform bills, even though it was police who were doing all the most of the violence and killing in January 6th. Apparently, we need police reform from the January 6th narrative, or the narrative promotes that. And Tucker last week, had at least two segments on January 6th narrative and skewering it. One of them he had Candace Owens on, which a lot of our listeners probably don't like. Candace Owens, they'll remember her for being a grifter, as being a past leftist who was involved in doxing, et cetera, et cetera. But for what her worth is, and yes, she gives off a lot of stupid points. She does have a certain value that I don't think all their mainstream conservatives have. And I'll get to her point on the January 6th narrative. But if you look at, one of the first big conservatives to challenge the George Floyd narrative was Candace Owens, who, went off about how he's a drug addict and he likely was not murdered and everything else. And this was the most watched video on Facebook in the week after George Floyd. And she was the only one willing to say that at that time. Everyone else was like, oh, this is the worst video I've ever seen. And now we're seeing in the court case that, what Candace Owens and people like us were saying were right. And she was the only major figure to say that. And millions of boomers who had been turning on, the news and seeing that this was like a modern day lynching of this poor little boy who's in his mid 40s and is a convicted criminal, which Candace always pointed out, is actually, maybe there's something more to this story. And their first, sign of that or bit of information from that was the Candace Owens Facebook video. So there's like, and then she's done other things. Like, I think whenever they have these stupid hearings on like white nationalism or racism in America or reparations, they always bring out Candace Owens, who then like bones these like shithead liberals from like the SPLC, and like is just goes off about how white nationalism isn't a problem and the real problem is Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And unfortunately, it would be nice if white people would say that in a mainstream discourse, but unfortunately, we're not allowed to. Only Tucker Carlson is, and he is hated for that. So Candace does bring a certain amount of value. Yes, she's a bit of a grifter. Yes, we shouldn't fully trust her. Yes, it's pathetic that conservatives always love these base blacks, but she does, compared to others, she usually is on the mark and is saying what we want to say, as in the case on this Tucker segment, is that she went off and was pointing out how, Black Lives Matter riots were worse. True. The same thing occurred during the Kavanaugh protests in 2018. True, but no one called that domestic terrorism. And she said that this is a modern day Reichstag fire, which I'm not sure if she knows what the Reichstag fire is, but we're glad she's bringing it up and that the Democrats are using this to suppress our civil liberties and go after their political enemies, which is true. I wouldn't necessarily say that this January 6th was a false flag. I mean, clearly these people were actual Trump supporters. Maybe there was a few Asian provocateurs in there, but the majority of the people were actual genuine Trump supporters, especially the people who have been arrested. But they are using this otherwise ordinary protests, and compared to what we were seeing, the rioting that we saw last summer, it was mostly peaceful. It was actually mostly peaceful. There was only a few. There was like at most like a dozen people who fought police, and the rest of them just walked around the Capitol and didn't really cause any harm besides stealing some mail. Not even really classified mail, but we're turning this into the greatest terrorist attack since 9/11, and it's being used to suppress our rights and to make this a less free country and to disenfranchise the millions and millions of people who voted for Trump. And this is the purpose of it, and we need someone to challenge it, and Tucker is doing that. And the next night he went on a segment about how the whole 5 people murdered line is total bullshit, and the only person murdered was Ashley Babbitt, and she was murdered by a black cop, not anybody else. That it was just Ashley Babbitt. The other 3, they still haven't released Brian Signett's cause of death, which his own family believes it was a stroke unrelated to the actions of that day. And it might be so, because otherwise they would be releasing a cause of death, which they, for 3 months after the fact, they still haven't gotten around to it. We wonder why. But the other 3 who died were all Trump supporters who died of natural causes. One died of a meth overdose, which why a Trump supporter was getting high off meth before, that's anybody's guess. And the other 2 died of heart problems that they had already had, heart issues before they went to the protest, and they died as a result of it. And the only person actually killed was Ashley Babbitt. And these other 4 were, and of those 4, they were Trump supporters, and we're still unsure of what caused Brian Sicknick's death, Officer Brian Sicknick. And we're probably we may never know, because they keep dragging this out. They have 2 guys that they arrested. They claim that the bear spray that they sprayed causes death, but there's still no evidence of that, and they're not charging those 2 guys with murder. They're just charging him with other offenses. So there is something to be skeptical about. But there are many things to be skeptical about in this persecution of political dissidents that is going on in the January 6th, in the aftermath of the January 6th thing. The FBI continues to show these images of people they're not even accusing them of a crime. They're just like, we need help with these people instigated terrorism or violence. And a lot of them look like ordinary boomers, and they're not necessarily accusing them of a crime, but they're just saying, we need your help. And this is the same FBI that pretty much has ignored Antifa and BLM riots for years and years. And now, for a sudden, that all their resources are being directed towards this. And the prosecutors are bragging about this. And if you guys watched the Michael Sherwin interview from 60 Minutes a few weeks ago, this guy was talking about like, oh yeah, we're going to get these guys for sedition. We can't wait we're bringing up on conspiracy charges, and we're definitely getting these guys for sedition. And, it's very odd for a prosecution team to run to the media and openly tout what charges they're going to bring. And many judges and legal experts are like, what are you doing? This is clearly tilting the scales of justice here. This is making a mockery of the judicial process. And there are, of course, many other things that are going on. First off, many of these people are being held without bond, even though most of their most serious charges are trespassing, are misdemeanors. Yet they're being held for months in effectively what is solitary confinement. They're not let out of their jail cell for 23 hours. They're kept in there for 23 hours a day. And so they only have 1 hour to get out, and this is their lives now. And usually their crime is that they walked around in the Capitol without permission. And that's the people who are getting nice. There's also 3 people who are alleging that black prison guards are beating the shit out of them. The guy who infamously put his feet on top of Nancy Pelosi's desk, which is apparently a serious felony to do. He reports that, another prisoner who was also severely beaten reports that black prison guards beat him, and they told him that, like, I hate honkies and I hate your religion and I hate white people religion. And there was another prisoner who had his eye socket permanently damaged by the beatings he was undertook from these prison guards. So this is ordinary. And when this was announced, like, liberal Twitter thought this was the greatest thing ever, that like this horrific abuse of prisoners, like, oh, cry me a river. And all these people, and also there's several people who always point this out, but liberal Twitter has like a fascination with their political enemies getting sodomized in jail. And they love the idea that all these ordinary Trump supporters are going to go to jail and get raped by some big black guy. And there's something really weird about that, messed up, but they love this idea. And anytime you see somebody complaining about the prisoners or the prisoners getting, arrested, you will see all these prison rape fantasies from liberal Twitter users. And when the news announced, I think it was a Political report that was announcing the abuse suffered by these 3 inmates, they were celebrating. It was like the greatest news that they had ever heard. And so this is just how, these are the same people who believe that, murderers should be let out, who are crying tears over these 2 black guys who had brutally murdered these youth pastors in Texas in 2000 and were set to be executed. And these people believe that, no black person should go to jail for anything. And they support cash bail elimination and police brutality, pretty much totally opposed. Like, police have to ask you nicely to put the handcuffs on. This is the liberal world, but as soon as they hear that prison guards are beating people into permanent blindness, they are soy jacking over that. So this is, they would support anything. They would support gulags being set up, internment camps for us. And you can see this, the evidence is clear by these replies to these stories. Even though this, people who have been arrested in the January 6th protests are considered the greatest terrorists since 9/11, many of them are facing charges, as I said before, nothing more than trespassing. But they are getting felonies from this very odious and draconian criminal charge that they're putting against many people. It's obstruction of an official proceeding. And this is a felony that could, because it carries the same weight as of obstruction of justice, and it carries a maximum penalty of 20 years. At least 75 people are charged with this, and they have, I think, nearly 300 people arrested so far, or maybe even more than that, but it's around that number, ballpark estimate. I think they're expecting to arrest 400 people. But they're having trouble, I guess, finding the other 100. I'm not quite certain. But this charge, they can claim that somebody who had been tweeting about Stop the Steal for weeks before those protests, that shows intent of trying to disrupt an official proceeding that was occurring at Congress, and thus they're getting hit with a felony charge that could send them to jail for 20 years. This is our justice system right here, is that your free speech can be used against you and is effectively being criminalized, and that they are setting a standard that whatever you tweet or Facebook post that is against the system narrative, they will use against you in a court of law, and they will use that to send you to jail for a very long time. And of course, liberals don't care about this. They support this. They want hate speech laws. They want people who spread misinformation about the election to face serious jail time and get raped in prison so their full fantasy can come true. And yeah, this is so there are political prisoners being arrested for their free speech. And this is something and this does need to be challenged. And I think Tucker is one of the few people to challenge that. Candace Owens is another person. Revolver people. Julie Kelly at American Greatness has been doing incredible work on this front. So this is a very important story. And the more the prosecution is embarrassed and to show that these people were doing nothing more than trespassing, that the more their cases fail, that their conspiracy charges fail, that there's no sedition charges. I mean, it's incredible to say we created sedition charges to charge Confederates, like actual Confederates from the 1860s. And we're using this to go after mostly peaceful protesters who had no chance of overthrowing the United States government. And they're using this to send a message to the 75 million people who voted for Trump. That's something to worry about. But our country is slipping more and more into a soft totalitarianism that is morphing into a hard totalitarianism. And it's something to keep a track of. And it is something, and this is not the last time that we're going to see these ridiculous charges imposed on ordinary Americans. The Biden administration will definitely weaponize another incident over the next 4 years to do the same thing that they're doing now. And the sooner this playbook falls apart, the better it is for ordinary Americans. Moving along, just two quick things I want to, just briefly mention before we move on to the Patreon questions, because we love our Patreon questions. I had a viral tweet that went out. I showed this graphic showing all the corporations and their employees and their donations, Trump versus Biden. And it's the 100 top employers in America and where they all donated. And pretty much all of them, with like 3 exceptions, who listed their employer, it went all to Biden. It was every major corporation. It went to Biden. The only employers where the majority of them went to Trump was the New York Police Department, the U.S. Marines, and the U.S. military. Now, the one thing to note about the U.S. military, that's just people who listed that as their employer. If you looked at the Department of Defense, overwhelming majority went to Biden. U.S. Navy, overwhelming majority went to Biden. Only the U.S. Army and the Air Force was mixed, and then the Marines was the only one. And the people who listed U.S. military as their employer were the only ones that went for Trump. And it was like a small majority. It wasn't even the large majorities that we're seeing in other corporations. And people were like, well, this is just ordinary people. But the people who are giving donations are generally better off. They're more likely to be executives in these corporations. They're not just generally the humble workers giving like $10 or whatever to a candidate. This is... and if that was the case, then you would have expected Biden to win by like 70% or 80%. And I guess all the unemployed people voted for Trump. But everyone at these major corporations voted for or supported Biden. So it does show that this whole institutional power is against us. It opposes us. And this explains why these corporations are going down the path of woke capitalism, why they oppose sensible voting reforms, why they oppose sensible immigration enforcement, why they support Black Lives Matter. These are all explained in this infographic, and I think people, whenever they talk about taking over institutions, you have to be like, well, which institutions? And I've always wanted to say the only institutions that we have, I've said this before, I think in a Thomas 77 podcast, it's police unions, it's megachurch, it's evangelicals, and it's fraternities. That's pretty much it. I mean, yeah, people be like, well, my church pastor with a Catholic church and etc. But I mean, the Catholic Church as an institution is generally on team left. I mean, even though a bunch of priests and some bishops all lean to the right and are pretty conservative, the general thrust of the institutional framework of that is in favor of the Democratic Party and the left, while pretty much all the big evangelical forces are on team right. So that's just something to keep in mind. With that is that, we have a very hard task in front of us when every institution is against us. And that's just a reminder to keep. The second thing I want to mention before moving on to the Patreon questions is that I had a new article on Revolver come out attacking Ronald Reagan. This actually came out because of Asa Hutchinson, the horrible governor of Arkansas, defending his decision to veto a ban on chemical castration of children because it's the conservative thing to do, and he cited Ronald Reagan. Well, and in the article I pointed out, even though I don't necessarily get into the social issues that animated Reaganism, and much of it was live and let live, even though this image of Reagan as this hardcore social conservative, not necessarily the case. As California governor, he signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country, and he also opposed many of the gay restrictions that were being supported in the 1970s. He opposed that. I mainly focused on immigration and trade and those issues. And when he was running in 1980, in his introduction speech, he talked about how he wanted to form a North American Union with Europe, I almost said Europe, with Canada and Mexico that would have open borders and totally unrestricted trade. And it was a more radical vision than what we got in NAFTA. And he constantly talked about how we need immigrants make America what it is. He gave a famous speech before, the Statue of Liberty, talking about how this is what made our country. The immigrants who came through Ellis Island are what made America. He talked about, he of course signed the 1986 amnesty. And even in 1980, in a debate with George H.W. Bush, they both competed over who could be the most pro-illegal immigrant and who could be the most generous towards this subject. This is Ronald Reagan. He was not somebody, as I say, he was just the conservative face for globalism. I don't think we should honor or remember his heritage. There are a few good things about him. I think even though a lot of people hate on his economic policies, a lot of his economic policies did help recover America from the horrible 1970s. He was supporting tough on crime policies that did help America overcome the huge crime wave that we've been suffering from in the 70s, and it continued in the 80s. But a lot of his policies allowed us to finally overcome the massive crime wave in the mid to late 90s. So there are some things about him, and he was appealing to these disaffected whites in a way that Trump was as well in 2016. But Trump was actually offering to defend their interests, while Reagan was offering to sell their interests to foreign markets and to outsource their jobs and to import cheap foreign labor here, because that's what the markets did. And most of the people who were considered hard right advisors of Reagan shared the similar globalist open border vision. And so I think Reaganism is best buried in the past, and people who continue to cite Reagan in the year of 2021 are incredibly cringe, as evidenced by Asa Hutchinson, who, I think, to get a point on Asa Hutchinson is, I think most people saw his interview with Tucker Carlson, which another thing that Tucker Carlson is doing is he's holding the feet to the fire holding these terrible Republicans' feet to the fire when they make huge mistakes. He also embarrassed Kristi Noem when she vetoed a ban on trans athletes and girls sports. And the same happened with Asa Hutchinson, is that Asa Hutchinson is so loyal to corporate and elite interests that he will refuse to do the thing that, even though his entire state legislature overrode his veto. He went against his own constituents, and instead he's hoping his constituents are the media. And he went on all these shows. He went on Jake Tapper. He went on Meet the Press, and he was like, "Oh, I'm a real conservative," and they were giving him head pats. But even Jake Tapper refused to let him, get the full head pat by calling him intolerant for signing a bill that banned trans athletes in girls sports. So Asa, and many people want to say that Kristi Noem, and still want to insist that Kristi Noem is like the future of MAGA or is going to be this great candidate in 2024. Asa Hutchinson, cowardly, cuckish Asa Hutchinson, did something that Kristi Noem was unwilling to do. So that is something to keep in mind. And actually, I think attacking. I mean, Asa Hutchinson. There's so many like him, and it is good to excoriate the Republican establishment. And I had somebody pointed out that Asa Hutchinson made his career by going after evangelical separatists, Christian fundamentalists, who some of them were into Christian identity and what would be framed as white supremacy. He made his career as a federal prosecutor going after them and giving very harsh sentences to these people for what effectively their main crime was, separating themselves from the mainstream of society and trying to build these rural communes. Not necessarily an endorsement of that, but I'm just saying that this is what we saw in the Clinton era when they went after Waco and went after Randy Weaver. So, and Asa Hutchinson shared that similar motivation. So that's something to suspect him on. But I do think it's more important to bring down Kristi Noem, because Kristi Noem, no one is ever going to think that Asa Hutchinson is going to run for president or be a MAGA celebrity. Well, Kristi Noem is, and the fact that she failed in that one regard is, I think, a more serious indictment of the Republican establishment and who they want to be future leaders than Asa Hutchinson playing to form. So that is something to keep in mind. Now on to the Patreon questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me or a guest questions or suggest topics for Highly Respected if you sign up for the Patreon option at Highly Respected's Patreon. The first question today comes from T. He asks, Scott, what do you think of Amazon's unionization effort failing? Well, I think it's, whether unionization, my main critique of unionization was independent of the Amazon effort, even though I took that as the news hook for my article on that I wrote for Revolver about Marco Rubio supporting the unionization effort. I don't think I think it would have. It wasn't necessarily. It was. I would say it's ultimately good that it failed. I don't necessarily say that it would have been great if it had. I mean, it would have hurt Amazon's business. But as I said before, as I argued in the article, Amazon can eat the cost of that. It's not going to hurt Amazon if these workers unionize. Where the cost is going to hurt is the consumer. Like, they're going to have to pay more and they're going to get shittier service due to the unionization effort. And these people are making more money than they do at Bessemer, at the Bessemer plant, than they do at any other job at Bessemer. I mean, the lowest paid worker is making $15 an hour, and $15 an hour in Bessemer, Alabama is pretty good money. It's not ideal money, but, starting salary at Amazon is pretty good. The conditions may be bad, and I mean, they should reform that, but that's ultimately something that concerns these workers. And people are like saying, oh, these are Trump voters. It's estimated that 85% of Bessemer's workers are black, and unless Brexit occurred in that area of Birmingham, in that Birmingham region, which it did not, no, those aren't Trump voters, and those aren't our people. And it's something that I think people were really worked up about and posing, saying that we stand with the working man, but instead this working man is never going to vote for Republicans and is hostile to our interests. And they're allied with a union that had previously supported a walkout to support a employee complaining that their company wasn't providing a substantial amount of money for their hormone treatment, a transgender employee. So, and of course, the same union has backed walkouts in favor of Black Lives Matter and open borders and immigrants and every left-wing cause you can imaginable. So this is no impediment to woke capitalism. It is part and parcel of woke capitalism, and it only push Amazon to go further to the left. You could see these same people, going on a strike because there's a Charles Murray book they had to ship, or there's a Tucker Carlson book they supply. So yeah, I don't. I think it's ultimately it's not a hugely important issue, even though I think people do need to understand that unions are not our friends. And even though union workers can be supportive and our allies, the unions themselves are bad. And anything that helps the unionization movement is not good. So this loss is ultimately good for our side. So that's what I would say in response to that question. The second question comes from Mr. Anonymous. He asks, Scott, who do you think is the best pick so far for 2024? What do you think of Ron DeSantis? Well, some people are going to find this controversial, who I'll say, and I've actually said, I may have said some things contrary to this, but ultimately the best pick, even though I don't know necessarily if he can run or he even can run, this best pick is still Trump. I think he is the chaos candidate. He is perceived as the greatest threat to the system. There is a strong story there that, this is somebody who is banished from the system. He's impeached twice. He is seen as a domestic terrorist. He's facing all this litigation, and he comes back and wins the White House. And that is such a devastating notion to the people in charge, to our enemies, that for that alone, I think he's the best candidate. And he's been around this before. Now, there could be some serious problems. One, he could be severely compromised over the next 4 years, even though all of his messages so far are pretty good that he's sending out. And it appears that the advisors who are around him are, much better than he had in the White House. He is going to be 78 in 2024. He could have health issues. His mental state could decline. We just see what happened when we elected another 78-year-old for president. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he can run. I think he's going to be facing some serious hurdles, litigation and tech censorship. I mean, I think you could see, if he did announce he was running for president, every corporation could band together and saying, we're not going to let this happen. And they could ban him from every payment processor, from every bank account. All of his campaign accounts are not allowed on any service. Like, you could even see his web browser kick him off. There's a lot of things, possibilities there. I mean, if he does run, and even with these challenges there, barring some changes, I don't think the Republican voters are going to get tired of Trump over the next 3 years. I think if he did announce, he would pretty much dominate the field. He would still have over 50% support. And these people who see as successors to Trump, they're not going to challenge him. So Ron DeSantis is not going to challenge him. He builds himself as the successor to Trump, not the challenger to Trump. I say this all the time. Some people imagine him as running as an anti-Trump nationalist. That's never going to happen. So on the thoughts to Ron DeSantis, I like him. I think after Trump, he is by far the best pick. He's doing everything correctly in Florida. He's standing up to tech censorship. He's trying to pass a censorship bill that would defend free speech. He's doing a lot of good things on immigration. He's doing a lot of good things on the masks and relation to the pandemic. He's keeping the state open, and he's good at tackling with the media. There are issues with DeSantis that I think, in a lot of people who are very anti-Trump, you would see a lot of the problems happen with DeSantis, with personnel. He's very neoconish. I think that's one thing to keep in mind. He passed some ridiculous anti-BDS bill in Florida. He's extremely pro-Israel, and a lot of those people would fill up his administration. You could see a war with Iran potentially with DeSantis if he gets in office, if Biden doesn't do that in his time. So there's that. It's the same with the personnel. A lot of these people will be conservative ink apparatchiks. I think another thing is the conservative ink really likes DeSantis. Unlike with Trump, you see National Review and Washington Examiner types all go, fawning over DeSantis in a way that they would never done for Trump. So that's something to keep in mind. Then all those people are going to get a spot in his administration. So he would have, I would see a lot of the same personnel decisions. He also doesn't have the charisma or the type of the ability to really connect on a very deep level that Trump is. Like, I think all the Trump fans like DeSantis, but they don't like him in the same way that Trump. They're not going to see him as the great leader. They see him as somebody that they could, vote for president, or certainly for governor. But there's as being the leader. I don't see DeSantis really filling that role. And yes, despite all of Trump's errors and failures and mistakes, he is able to serve as that great leader role. And there is something to be said for that. And I don't see anyone else as, even though they may be a good president, they may be able to win an election, they do not serve that role. And you do need that type of rallying leader for what we're facing in the future and the challenges we have. And there needs to be that central figure. And I don't think you're not going to see people travel, hundreds of miles to go see a DeSantis rally, or to deck themselves out in DeSantis gear, or base their identity around being a DeSantis supporter in the way that you have with Trump. And there are some issues with that, but there is an awakening among white America on the phenomenon around Trump, even though, yes, Trump is not perfect. And yes, there are many issues that come with that. There is a certain, to use a big word, ethnogenesis that's happening around Trump. And you wouldn't see that around DeSantis. That's not something that he can really fix. I mean, and there is something with his, he says the right things. He's doing the right things. I think he's handling a lot of these media crises well, and he's doing a great job as governor. He's much better than Hawley, Ted Cruz, Cotton, all these other people are trying to, and certainly much better than Kristi Noem and Nikki Haley and etc. All these people who want to be seen as Trump's successor. And if Trump doesn't run, yes, we're going to support DeSantis. DeSantis is our guy. But if we had to pick between the two, despite his errors and failures, you go with Trump. Trump sends a stronger message, and and if he runs, he's gonna win the primary. I mean, DeSantis has no chance. So, but either one would be much better than the other candidates we had in 2016, and certainly better than 2012, and going back and up until Pat Buchanan. So, I would say. So the question, we would, at this moment, we would prefer Trump. There could be things to change that we would not prefer Trump. But I think just on the message alone, that would be sent by him running and winning. And, there's no other candidate who can compare to that. But I do like DeSantis. There are issues with him that people need to, realize. I think a lot of people are just so desperate for a superior Trump that they're imagining a DeSantis that doesn't exist in reality. Even though he is a good governor, there are many positive traits to him, and he would be the next best choice. And maybe he would even be a much better president than Trump. We don't know, but he would come with a lot of the same baggage. So, that's my thoughts on that subject. And that is it for the show this week. We may have another episode later this week. I'll keep you posted. But until next time, stay respected.